Good evening and welcome to this presentation of Modernizing the Theory of Mind. This is the first in a series of graduate level presentations on hypnotherapy. I'm pleased to have a member of the public here tonight. Much of the content which will be presented tonight is really accessible. The more esoteric aspects or complex aspects have to do with the way that different people do hypnotherapy, but I'm sure that will also be interesting. It doesn't consume very many slides in the presentation, but it will give you some insight as to how people look at solving problems with their clients. This presentation is being recorded tonight, so please be aware that if you have any concerns about having questions or comments heard by other people in a public forum, everything that's said here will be actually posted up onto the web or YouTube. So anyway, the theory of mind that we're referring to is taught at the Hypnosis Motivation Institute in Encino, California. And the institute was founded 50 years ago. It's the oldest accredited hypnotherapy training college by Dr. John Kappas, who was a Greek patriarch and was very comfortable telling other people what to do. So he had a certain approach to hypnotizing people and solving their problems, which is basically he would reprogram them. But the thing that, whether that plays into the theory of mind, is that it was designed basically as a way of creating confusion in people so that they were easy to hypnotize. But along the way, as people began to refine and develop the theory of mind, what the people that were taught it and exposed to it realized is that it gave them a lot of understanding about why they had the problems that they do. And that creates a great deal of comfort and confidence in the therapeutic process. And so one of the things that I did when I was attending HMI was to begin to realize that, you know, the confusing way that the theory of mind was presented actually limited the ability of people to fully understand and participate and be confident in the therapeutic process. And so furthermore, as I began to read more about psychology, I began to realize that there were certain aspects of the theory of mind that had to do with the fact that John Kappas was a Greek patriarch and thought that being rational and putting logic and reason and everything like that first in your life was the right way to go about leading your life. But actually, that's not the way that most people lead their lives. And so we'll talk about these issues through the course of this presentation. But the most important thing was the motivation was that I realized that there were certain unanswered questions in the theory of mind, things that weren't satisfying about it. And that so I began to rework it in order to support my own style of therapy. And when I was done, I found that it was not just an introduction to hypnotherapy, it actually was an introduction to the whole topic of why our personalities evolve the way that they do. There's a whole bunch of other material that John Kappas brought together that we'll summarize a little bit today, which helps people to be more confident and more active and more empowered in terms of moving through the therapeutic process. So we'll touch on that as well. And then at the end, I'll present my theory of mind. Evening. So here's the roadmap for the presentation. First of all, what is a theory of mind? There's three important parts of the theory of mind in the context of hypnotherapy. The first is how the mind develops. That explains how people got to where they were in their life. And it explains why they have inner conflict. Why is it that when you make up your mind that you want to, for example, stop eating pickles and start eating tofu, okay, why it's such a struggle, even though rationally you can just understand that pickles are not as good for you as tofu is, and you should eat tofu. Why is it so hard to change? Well, that's because there's inner conflict there. There's some part of our mind which resists that decision. And then there's the whole issue of explaining to people why hypnotherapy works and is as effective a method as it is for the kinds of things that hypnotherapists can address for their clients. It's known to be roughly 8 times faster than psychotherapy, than just regular talk therapy. It adds a lot of leverage to helping people to overcome their challenges and to grasp opportunities that may have been evading them. So after going through all these aspects, I'm going to talk about the limitations of the theory of mind that was taught at HMI in the introductory class. And then I'll go through and present my revised theory of mind. And there'll be discussion at the end. So how does the mind develop? Well, okay, so let's start with what does the brain do? And the brain is a wonderful and complex machine. But it's actually, in principle, the way that it actually learns is not that complicated, particularly in the cortex. There's certain exceptions to this kind of summary that I've got here that has to do with processing things like vision and sound and things like that, just the raw sensory input. There's other kinds of mechanisms that come into play. But in terms of learning and changing our behavior, the brain is really pretty simple in terms of the way that it's organized. The first thing it does is it figures out what things happen together. Once that happens, you can begin to say, okay, well, when does something happen that feels good to me, and when does something happen that feels bad to me? And you can try to evolve behaviors that allow you to feel good. Now, once that gets established in your mind, you can begin to kind of bias the system. You can begin to kind of try to bias your life by, planning things out and figuring out how to create the preconditions so that the things that need to happen together for you to feel good happen more often. The things that happen together to make you feel bad happen less often. And what we eventually realize is that relationships are really, really important in that process. And so these things, this is not just what the brain does. This is also implicitly, there's a dependency upon these things. The first thing that we have to do is you have to learn how to process our sensory information. That's kind of a precondition for everything else here. And then we figure out what things happen together. And then that includes our emotions and our feelings and our sensations. So then, we try to figure out how can I feel good? And then we plan ahead and we build relationships. Everything that comes, everything that happens later in this process is built on what happens underneath this process. And it's even more powerful than that. Okay, even more significant than that, because if somebody says the word line to you, do you see that line over there? What that does is that preps the visual system to recognize and be extra sensitive to the presence of lines in the world around you. So the higher functions aren't just built upon the lower functions, they actually reinforce the lower functions. And so this means that if you learn how to see certain kinds of things when you're a child, okay, or hear certain kinds of syllables in language, okay, you go and you talk, you start to interact with somebody who speaks a different language, you may not even be hearing what they're saying. And you're going to interpret the phonemes that they're making in a way that translates them into kind of like words that are familiar to you. And one of the things that people who are studying foreign languages have to learn to do is how to turn off that filtering function, that expectation that comes from the language at the higher level, so that they can actually hear what someone is saying when they're speaking a foreign language. And it's at that point in time that you can begin to learn to speak the language. So not only are things built on the things below, but they tend to bias our perceptions of what's happening underneath. So here's the magic. How does this all happen? It's actually, again, a very simple system, but it's got a lot of complexity to it and a lot of possibilities and a lot of refinements that occur over time. Okay, so the first thing is that you've got signals coming in from your senses, and they travel through the brain from one neuron to the next neuron over something called an axon. And that axon, so there's a signal path, and information flows through the brain, which connects one neuron to another neuron or set of neurons further on down in the brain. So whenever we want to learn something new, or whenever we recognize that something is happening, basically what happens is that a bunch of input signals come up to a neuron, that neuron fires, and then it can go on to someplace else. And so what's happening when you're figuring out what things happen together is that you have two neurons that are firing simultaneously, and they kind of eventually come together at another neuron and say, okay, well, these two things are, this is the neuron that's telling you that these two things are happening together. Now, there's multiple inputs to each neuron, but there's a single output, which is the axon. And the inputs to the neuron can either trigger or suppress the firing of the next, its own firing. Okay, some things inhibit the flow of information, kind of like saying, don't send this message on, or a stop sign or something like that, as well as things that say, go ahead and pass this information on down the road. Okay, so this is the mechanism that we all kind of get taught about, where we think that the brain is like a computer, but there's some extra functions here which are much different from how the way the computer works. And the first of these is along the axon, those little red beads that are on that axon, there's cells called oligodendrocytes that when they see lots of signals flowing along an axon, they begin to wrap it around with something called myelin. And when an axon becomes fully myelinated, signals can flow up to 100 times faster on that axon. And the story I like to share about this is when I was in college, I came home one Christmas, and my parents had bought the family an Atari game system, and we were playing Astra Smash, which is a really primitive kind of shooter game where you move your little shooter back and forth across the screen, and the asteroids are dropping down from above, and you break them up into smaller pieces until you annihilate them. So what happened was that, I played this thing, and the entire family was playing it, and I was pretty good. I got to 40,000 points, before I went back to school. So I would go back up to school, and I come home that summer, and I had some, dates with my friends and things like that. And but I came home later on that first night, and my mother and my brother were playing, and they were at 14 million. And it was just a blur on the screen. I couldn't even see what was going on. No clue. They could, because that's the part of their brain that processed that information had been fully myelinated, and they could actually see what was happening and play the game effectively. So this is the huge difference with myelin. And when you practice a violin or a flute or something like that, what you're doing is you're myelinating so that the timing is exactly right. You need to get your fingers to move in exact coordination, and that's all about timing. So myelin is what controls excellence in performance, and tuning the myelin and its placement is what controls excellence in performance. So the next element in terms of the way the brain works is that there's a sensitivity. There's a gap. The electrical signal doesn't flow directly from one neuron to the next. There are gaps called synapses, and what the synapses control is how big the signal needs to be on the transmitting side to cause the effect that's intended, either triggering or suppressing on the receiving side across the synapse. And this is done by neurotransmitters. And so what happens is the neurotransmitter is kind of like a gain knob on a microphone or something like that. The higher you have the gain turned up, the more neurotransmitters you have, the more likely the louder the sound's going to be. If you turn it way down, that's like there not being very much neurotransmitter. And what's important to understand for people that are dealing with mental wellness issues is this is the only thing that the drugs they give us for mental wellness affect. It doesn't affect the myelin. It doesn't affect the neurons, except for if there's a problem that the brain is trying to solve, and you change the gain at the synapses, and the brain really has to solve that problem, it's going to build new pathways. It's going to add myelin or remove myelin. It's going to try to get you to solve the problem no matter what. So the drugs that we are given don't deal with the entire system. And in fact, when you come off of drugs, you have to be titrated off of them, off of these psychoactive substances. You got to be titrated off of them so that your brain can relearn things that it may have acquired while you were on the drugs. Okay. And then the last element here is blood flow. All of this activity inside of the brain requires energy. It creates metabolic waste that's got to be cleaned out. And so the parts of the brain that we use the most get more blood flow. It's just like exercising a muscle, and becomes stronger, becomes more active. Okay. So the important thing to understand about all this is part of the way that the brain learns as rapidly as it does is it recycles. So, you know, if you're out in the forest and, you know, it's winter or it's autumn, there's certain kinds of food sources around. And so you get tuned up about recognizing certain kinds of food sources, and then it go through winter and there's different kinds of food sources, and then in spring there's different kinds of. What happens is that the brain is constantly adapting to process the sensory information so that you can survive, because the environment is not constant. And John Galway, one of the world's great flutists, says that if he doesn't practice 1 day before a concert, he knows the difference. 2 days without practice before a concert, and the critics know the difference. And 3 days, it's the audience knows the difference. And the reason why is because the brain is taking the myelin off of his flute playing neurons, you know, that network for flute playing, and saying, oh, you know, John is interested in, you know, playing pachinko now. Okay, so let's start tuning up his pachinko networks. Okay, and probably he wouldn't be doing that. He'd probably be going off to art exhibits and things like that. But you know, the brain is always trying to serve our needs. And so it adapts and reclaims resources constantly to enable us to learn and adapt to new conditions. So you have to keep on using what you've got or you lose it. This is one of the primary issues in cognitive decline. So the important thing to understand about hypnosis or trance is that it's our ideal learning state. When we are in a trance state, which is a natural state, falling in love is a trance state. Okay, being in the zone in sports competition is a trance state. What happens is that this whole process of evolution and adaptation is going on in the optimal way. And so part of what hypnotherapy is about is it's just helping people to learn to adapt their behavior as rapidly as possible by getting them into that state. Now, there's 2 different kinds of behaviors that we have. And it's important to understand this because when we're in children, we establish subconscious conditioned reactions, they're called. And they're called reactions because we don't reason our way through them. We're not having them explained to us and justifying them in any way. It's just what works. And this is kind of the way that animals learn. And so this is built down at the very base of our personality in the earliest stages of our lives. We're not reasoning our way through things. We're just trying to figure out how to make things work in our life. So there's 2 kinds of conditioned reactions. One is classical, and this is the famous Pavlov dogs experiment, which is you present a dog with a bowl of food and he salivates, and you ring a bell and the dog doesn't salivate, and then you ring the bell while presenting the bowl of food, the dog salivates. And if you do this enough times, when you ring the bell, the dog salivates. You've changed its behavior, and it's simply an associative kind of a behavior. Okay, the dog's salivating because it's expecting something good to happen and it's preparing to eat. Okay, and if you associate the bell with that enough times, then it thinks that the bell is also a signal that it's going to get something to eat. The other kind of conditioning is called operant conditioning, and this is a situation where there's just a reward or a cost. This is a situation where, for example, the baby, you know, wants to feel warm versus cold, or a child wants to feel warm versus cold. You know, they wake up in the middle of the night, they feel cold. There's some resources around, like, you know, okay, there's a pillow, and there might be a stuffed toy or something like that. There might be a binky, okay, and the baby eventually, or the small child eventually, figures out that if you pull the binky up around you, then you'll be warmer. So you just explore and figure things out. It's not necessarily a situation where it's explained to you. The child, by just, you know, trying different things, can eventually figure out that the binky enables them to stay warm. And the thing that's very important about this is that the end result of operant conditioning, there's 2 end results. One is adaptation, where you know how to solve the problem, okay, and you move forward to explore new problems and try to make your life even better on the basis of the skills that you have so far. The other one is anomie. And the classic experiment in this case is you have rats in 2 cages, and the rats always get the same number of shocks. There's just a voltage that can be applied to the base of the cage, and the rats are always going to get the same number of shocks. But in the first cage, the rat can go and press a button so that for 30 seconds or a minute or something like that, it knows there won't be any shocks. It has some sense of control over the process. It turns out, and the second rat doesn't have that control. It turns out that the first rat is fine. It plays, it eats, you know, it socializes, everything like that, okay? The second rat lies on the floor of the cage and quivers. That's a state of anomie. They believe that they have no control over their reality. And so this is a very important aspect of conditioning early on in our lives, okay? And this has a lot to do with the way that people go out exploring the world and whether or not they're empowered to actually explore the world and find success in it. So the second way of learning falls into the category of conscious chosen responses. And there's two main strategies for doing this. These are situations where we learn something from another person and then we apply it to our own lives. And so the first case is story or analogy. So one story is girl meets frog, okay? The other one may be the frog prince, okay? And whether you, which story you choose, okay, depends upon how well, you know, whether you identify with the characters in the story. So a young lady who identifies as a princess might like the girl meets frog story. A young lady who identifies as kind of an entrepreneurial kind of go-getter type of taking the initiative in the world might, you know, like the frog prince story. Okay. The thing is that's really powerful about stories is that for that reason, there's a lot of flexibility. We get to choose the stories that we live, and we get to change the stories if they're not working for us. And we might even just go to see a movie and decide that, hey, I really like that story. I want to go off and live that story for a while and see what that's like. The characters are kind of my age, and I'm sympathetic to their goals. And so let me try this out for a while. So this is very flexible. It also creates conditions, though, where we can, you know, once we pick a role in the story, then we know who we're looking for in the world. You know, if you've got a Cinderella perspective, you know you're looking for your prince. Okay, and so that kind of helps us to sort through the people that are presented to us in our life and try to and have some, you know, kind of ability to pick people that we'll succeed with. Now, the second strategy is the strategy of design. And in design, there's some theory about the way things work. There's some planning process of picking out, you know, a kind of sequence of actions that will achieve a result, and then you put it into play and execution. And the thing that's great about design is that it's really predictable. Okay, even if you get the answer wrong, you know, the fire is going to burn out before you get to the end of the evening, and you're going to be cold and bored and won't be able to make s'mores like you were planning. But, you know, at least you're going to be able to say, okay, I know why that happened. You know, we put too much wood on, you know, early on in the process, and if I just slowed the thing down, it'll work out fine next time. So there's a lot of predictability in this. The problem is that when things fail, they fail catastrophically. It's very difficult to change course once you've gone down the path of design. And so this is a significant aspect of the challenges that we have in our relationships, including in our politics, which is these two different views of how to get around in life. One of the challenges with design is it's something that, you know, really intelligent people are really good at building complex designs of things, and they're totally incomprehensible to the people that aren't as smart as them. And so what they do is they want to find simpler stories that they kind of let them move through, and they can just do what makes sense to them, and they expect that everybody will understand where it is that they're going and allow them to achieve, you know, to try to achieve their goals, even if maybe sometimes the rules are broken. And one of the things that is typical of people who follow stories is that they have street smarts as opposed to knowing the law. So one thing as we're going through these, even with these two frameworks being established, as we're growing up, we also have an evolution of our self-concept. And these correspond to very important stages of literacy in terms of the way that we negotiate with the world around us. So the first stage of literacy is doing. Okay, it's about controlling our muscles and our energy and everything like that to be able to accomplish certain specific tasks. So this is a practical form of literacy. And so when we ask children when they're little, what do you want to be when you grow up? They say, I want to be a fireman. They don't say, I want to be happy. They don't say, I want to be rich. They say, I want to be a fireman. They know how to do things, okay? Later on down the road, as you master doing things, okay, you begin to understand what things you do correlate with the feelings inside of you. And so there's a big move now in pop psychology, which is about emotional intelligence, which is about feeling, okay? And this is where a lot of the enjoyment and motivation in life comes from, is from how we feel. Now, this gets you up into what's called the limbic system, which is the primitive mammalian part of the brain. But on top of all of that, and this arises we only really have the mechanisms to actually deal with moral literacy when we're well into our adulthood, quite often only about the time we're 26 or so. And this is, so moral literacy occurs in the frontal lobes, that part of the forehead, which is called the third eye. And this is part of why the third eye is where it is because it's the seat of moral analysis. Now remember that everything that comes later is built upon what comes below and reinforces it. So one of the things that's really important about moral literacy is that moral principles are durable. What you do is going to change because your body changes. What you feel is going to change because your relationships change over time, okay? But you can always choose to be honest. You can always choose to be compassionate. And so when we get to the level of moral principles in the prefrontal cortex, it stabilizes our personality across all the transitions in our lives. When we retire, we don't fall into collapse because we can't do that job any longer. We're no longer a plumber. And so we just get despondent and don't know what to do. Or if we're, a mother that invests a lot of feeling in raising her children and inspiring them and celebrating them and everything like that. And when they leave the house, who am I anymore? Okay, when we get to the level of moral reasoning in the frontal lobes, okay, well, I invested emotion in my children because I'm creative, because I'm constructive, and all these other kinds of things. Well, where are places where I can exercise those qualities to bring value to other people's lives? And so you just shift who you are to a different context, to doing something different. Okay, so that's the map for personal development. And we want that to be in our theory of mind that we present to people when we're introducing them to hypnotherapy. Okay, so where does inner conflict come from? It all seems pretty straightforward, things built on top of other things. Why should there be any inner conflict? And one of the other things that, so let's just look at the stages of development, the evolution of our mental faculties, kind of in a more kind of externally visible kind of way, okay? So in the first year of life, we're kind of really focused on sensory processing. We get basic motor control. Maybe we can walk around and things like that at the end of 2 years. So now we can explore our environment independently. We're really confident about language around 5 years. About 10 years, you have Catholic First Communion at 8 years old. That's the age of reason. You can make decisions for yourself. But we only really get that under control around 10 years of old. So we basically begin to understand cause and effect. So we got basic logic going on in our brain at that point in time. Then we had this very powerful urge to leave the home, which has to do with hormones and things like that when puberty kicks in. And so we begin to really think about our identity and who we are in relationship to our peers. And that begins to kind of solidify around 15 years. And it's not until we're 25 years old that we have really a sense of other concern, where we can engage fully in moral reasoning about what's right in the world without being really focused first upon what's to our benefit. Okay, so where in here do we get the conscious and subconscious split in the mind? Okay, we're not built with it. We know that. Okay, so why does it arise? Now, where Kappas, who was a guy who was really big on cause and effect and rational, where he put things was cause and effect is where the conscious and subconscious break in the mind occurs. Okay, but there doesn't seem to be any really strong motivation why that should be the cause. I mean, why is logic something that doesn't help language, doesn't help motor control, that doesn't help sensory, why would cause and effect cause the mind to break into two pieces? So this was something that was a real issue for me, and I thought that it really weakened the power of the theory of mind that he presented. Okay, so let's look for another answer to that question. So let's look at the human condition. Okay, so first of all, humans are animals, and animals have two primary goals. First is to survive, the second is to reproduce. And the mechanisms in the body that kind of organize the way that different kinds of animals deal with these two challenges have been kind of evolving for 3 billion years. And so there's a pattern that becomes obvious, especially among the more intelligent animals, okay, which is how do you deal with the conflict that arises from survival and reproduction as kind of competing goals between animals. So because you have conflict, when you get into that conflict, there's a trauma. So the first thing that an animal does after it's had a trauma, if it survives, is it goes to safety. And then it quivers. And the reason why it's quivering is because when you're in trauma, you go into fight or flight. And in fight or flight, your muscles are building up toxins faster than the blood flow can remove them. And your entire system is building up toxins faster than the body can remove them. So animals only typically stay in fight or flight for 30 seconds at a time. Longer than that, and it's no longer, it's, there's a real question of survival. Okay, so when they get into safety again, which may mean simply one of them giving up and walking away, in the case of a competition for reproductive opportunity, what happens is they quiver. And what the quivering does is it kind of loosens up the muscles so the blood can flow again and discharge those toxins. And so the animal does that for a little while, and then it gets up and it moves on. So now you've got humans, and we're clearly different. We took over the world about 2,000 years ago, roughly. Most of us weren't really concerned about competing with other animals. We were really under social circumstances where the most important question as concerns our survival is the person I'm with my enemy or my friend? So this is a question of social discernment, which occurs in the prefrontal cortex, which most other animals don't have. And this is the highest mental function of the mind. And it's the reason why, in part, we won. It's because we organize and we teach our children and things like that, okay? So, but there's a different pattern now when we have conflict, okay? Because you never know when your friend is going to become your enemy or your enemy is going to become your friend. You have no control over that, and it can happen quite suddenly. So instead, we have the pattern of anxiety, which is we have some kind of a trauma, which can be a pleasant thing. You can get really, really super excited. You can have this, this wonderful, you can drink this wonderful drink and you feel fantastic. And, but it's so out of the norm for your experience that actually your system doesn't know how to deal with it. Okay, and so even pleasant things can be a trauma. So the things we have this trauma, and now we're focused on prevention. Why did it happen? How do I control the people around me to either cause this to happen more or to cause it to happen less? Okay. And the unfortunate thing is, particularly when it was an unpleasant experience, is that the only thing that we have control over actually in the world, because people can always change their minds, is ourselves. And so what we do is we go into self-denial. We start saying, you know, falling in love was really painful in the long run. I'm not sure I want to do that again. So we really hesitate to take that step. We go into the state of self-denial. So what does this have to do with the breakdown of the conscious and subconscious mind? This is why it breaks down. This is why the mind breaks down and splits into two. We go to school, we leave the family environment where we have our conditioned reactions. We go out into this social environment. We have to kind of learn to discern. When do I need to do what I do at home? When do I need to do what I do at school? It might be as simple as, okay, you had a book report that was due, but it's time to go to bed. So you say, okay, well, I'm at home now, so I better go to bed. Then you get a 0 on your book report, and it comes home and your parents are just go through the roof. Okay, so what's all that about? So what happens is that this is the central issue in terms of the conscious mind breaks off, the mind actually breaks off and creates the conscious mind as your social identity to go out and explore the world, try to figure out how it works. Okay, and it's not until you go to sleep at night that the rest of the mind gets the events of the day and begins to start in dreams figuring out whether or not you can deal with the new experiences and whether they're beneficial to you or whether they're, you know, something that you want to avoid, and tries to figure out whether it can succeed in helping you to get the things that are good and avoid the things that are bad. That all happens in dreams at night. So the learning process really slows down once this split occurs, which is why hypnotherapy is so powerful. And now the thing that's so important in this process then is that based upon our experiences, we have these mental faculties and these behavior patterns, which we need to exhibit at different times in different places. So sometimes we want to protect, we want to go into a safe zone. Sometimes we want to explore. We need to have balance between these two things because after all, we need to get some food every now and then. We can't just stay at home all the time. Okay. There's also doing versus imagining. We've only got one visual analysis system in our brain, okay? And we can either be doing something or we can be imagining something that we're going to do, but it's really hard to do both at the same time, okay? There's just the visualization system in the brain has difficulty splitting into two pieces and doing both at the same time. Big conflict and challenges, whether you're going to try to get what you want or whether you're going to focus on what the group needs. Okay, so this whole I, we. Then there's reacting versus responding. Sometimes you need to run like hell. Okay, you just need to let your body take over and create safety for you. But there are also people who are trained to respond in those circumstances, and they need to respond effectively to protect other people. And we consider them to be heroes. And so we make decisions about, you know, reaction and responding, and when we're going to do that, and when we're going to prepare to respond in situations where most people would react. And then there's the whole issue of past, present, and future. Do we stay stuck in the things that happened to us in the past? Are we present in the current moment and dealing with what's in front of us? And shouldn't we actually be also thinking at times about what's going to happen in the future? So one of the primary goals of all therapy is to identify and recognize, and in our own lives as people, to recognize when we're out of balance in these regards. And this is not just some framework that I came up with. This is actually a framework which comes out of psychology. And this covers most of the critical issues in our lives, okay, including the one thing that's obvious that isn't explicitly here is mortality, which is a concern for the future. Okay, so now you've got a mind which has some needs, and how do you go about trying to help that individual feel successful and fulfilled as they move through life? If they've got a block inside of them, they've got some kind of an imbalance. And the inspiration for this part of the talk came from a book by Stephen Gilligan, who was a protege of Milton Erickson's. John Kappas and Milton Erickson were the two great hypnotherapists of the 20th century. Kappas was far more pragmatic and practical and solutions focused. Erickson was an academic who really had a deep psychological understanding of the way that the brain worked, and a very deep, it turned out, spiritual orientation as well, and philosophy to the work that he was doing. When I was at school at HMI, I realized that, you know, the kind of the telling somebody else what to do thing that John Kappas really perfected. Although he did soften later on in his career, and he did stimulate the development of a set of techniques called therapeutic imagery, which is much more of a collaborative kind of a process. He was really kind of an authoritarian in terms of the way that he went about solving problems with his clients. Erickson, on the other hand, was a collaborative hypnotherapist. And what he ended up saying ultimately was that he didn't know what was going to happen when he went into trance with somebody. He talked about it as a joint state of mind, where you were in trance together with somebody else. He said, you never know what's going to happen once you go into trance. Basically, the client effectively looks into you for resources that are necessary for healing and calls them out of you. And it was clear to me when I was training at HMI that this is just intrinsic to my personality. This is the way that I work as a therapist. And so I was very inspired by what Gilligan had to say about Milton Erickson's perspective on this. And it's very important to me because in both cases, the client needs to understand what's happening. You need to present them a theory of mind, which guides them into the process that you're engaged in and leaves them no surprises, so that they feel that the process is fully consensual, that they've chosen it. One of the things that Milton Erickson wrote about deep trance is he said that the most critical issue for the therapist in therapy is protecting the integrity of the subject's personality, which is apparently vulnerable when they're in trance. And so we need to make sure that there's full disclosure and clarity about this. And so as we get to the theory of mind later on down the line, I'm going to have two outcomes, two endpoints for the theory of mind based upon the two primary therapeutic strategies. So I've talked about Erickson. This all comes from Milton Erickson via Stephen Gilligan, his protege. Gilligan actually outlines three strategies. One is the authoritarian strategy, and that's the Kappasinian camp, which is you basically tell the client's subconscious how to change so that the client achieves the results that they want. There's a second category that I'm not going to really focus on, which is academic. Academic hypnosis really is focused on trying to prove that hypnosis works. And so what happens is they have standardized inductions, they have standardized scripts for dealing with the conditions of the client and everything like that. They don't address the individuality of the subject. And as a result of that, and Erickson was very clear about this, they generally don't achieve very good results. But this is what you see on WebMD. This is what you see in the Psychology Today and things like that. Okay, you see the results of these academic studies. And one of the things that as hypnotherapists, we've got to be aware of this particular category, because it's something that clients come to us and says, well, yeah, I read this article and it said hypnotherapy doesn't work. Okay, but my friend told me, so which one is right, the friend or the article? And we can now address this by just saying, oh, that's an academic study and it's got certain limitations. But Erickson saw himself as a collaborative hypnotherapist. And so I'm going to focus on the difference between the authoritarian and the collaborative approaches to hypnotherapy. So authoritarian hypnotherapy comes, believe it or not, out of, maybe it's fully believable, it comes out of exorcisms in the late 18th century. And priests there were actually exorcist priests who would, like, you know, publicize that they were coming to town to exorcise somebody. There would be huge crowds that would come in. And what happened was that Anton Mesmer kind of move that set of practices over into kind of a scientific framework, which he called, was oriented around animal magnetism and things like that. So, but the primary assumption is that the client lacks psychological sophistication. They weren't raised in late 20th century or 21st century America, where you've got pop psychology books where you can find out all kinds of things about narcissism and depression and everything like that. These people had no idea why they were the way that they were. So for that reason, it's convenient for the therapist to believe that the subconscious is primitive. Okay, it's just a decision-making machine, and if you rewire it, you can get the results that you want. But this also means that psychoeducation is essential, because the one thing that the subconscious has to rely upon is the conscious mind. The conscious mind is out in the social world, and it's figuring out who to trust and who not to trust and everything like that. And the subconscious, before it does anything, is always going to check with the conscious mind. So you need to fill the conscious mind up with good reasons for what you're doing in the subconscious, so that validation occurs. And this was learned by Freud, because Freud did this. He just reprogrammed people's minds. And about 6 months down the road, they started ignoring his suggestions. Okay, just the whole hypnotherapy just stopped working for Freud. And this is why for 50 to 75 years, psychology just poo-pooed hypnosis, because it didn't work for Freud. And this is the reason why it didn't work. Now, the thing that happens is that I talked about, that transfer between the conscious mind when you're falling asleep, okay? And that's a transition between the two modes, resting, waking, and dreaming, which is called the alpha theta boundary. So it's that kind of that dreamy, kind of not quite sure whether you're awake or not kind of a state as you're falling asleep. And the brain is operating at about 9 beats per second. So it's really slowing down. And the way that you get people there is you overwhelm that barrier between the conscious and subconscious, which blocks things. We call it the critical mind. You just give it too many things to think about. And eventually it just throws up its hands and says, I'm overwhelmed. I don't know what to do. It goes into kind of a panic mode, that react mode. And in the react mode, the subconscious comes out and tries to make sure that you're okay. It just takes over and does whatever it needs to do at a very primitive level to make sure that you're okay. And if the therapist is soothing at this stage in time, the subconscious kind of just begins to accept information from them. So what you're trying to do at this level then is change conditioning. The therapist is going in, they're changing those conditioned responses that came from either that classical conditioning or from operant conditioning. It's very predictable. You know what the outcome is going to be. And it's the foundation for stage hypnosis. So a lot of people are biased against this form of hypnosis because they see stage hypnosis. And so one of the things that we have to do as hypnotherapists, as authoritarian hypnotherapists, is we have to be focused on overcoming this resistance on the part of our clients. But this is a perfectly acceptable way to do hypnotherapy. And one of the things that's really good about it is that there's less transference. There's less identification between the social identity of the subject and the authority of the hypnotherapist. So the client is not always looking to the hypnotherapist for answers. They're not thinking about, gosh, I should ask my hypnotherapist about this. Okay, the hypnotherapist deals with the subconscious mind. So there's some real advantages to this approach. Talked about the academic. It's objectively rigorous. It's got standardized procedures and suggestions. It does not address it in individual psychology. Therefore, it has constrained efficacy, and it's what's reported, unfortunately, in journals and referenced on WebMD. So it gives people a kind of a biased perspective about hypnotherapy and its effects. Now let's talk about Erickson's collaborative hypnotherapy. And what's different about this is encapsulated by this statement from Erickson. The conscious mind is smart, but the unconscious is far more intelligent. And so what this is indicating is that Erickson was not suppressing the conscious mind. And he doesn't even use the term subconscious, okay? What he was doing when he was putting people into trance was unifying the conscious and subconscious minds, getting access to the full capacities of the mind. And this is the state that we live in childhood. And as a collaborative practitioner, when I get somebody to trance for the first time, they quite often come out and say, gosh, I remember feeling this way when I was a kid. You know, if they had a really pleasant, rewarding childhood, that's what they say. I just remember feeling this way when I was a kid. So this is also a state that's known to master meditators and religious devotionals who have full alignment between the way that they live their lives and their moral principles, okay? So there's no need for the separation anymore because everything is fully aligned in them. It's called the gamma state. And in the gamma state, the brain works at 25 to 100 beats per second. This is way, way faster than any other state of the mind. And the reason why is because the entire mind is unified at that point in time. You're learning and using everything all at once. Now, Erickson did not have an integrated psychoeducation. He was very intuitive in terms of the way that he did things. He knew a lot about the brain, was incredibly sophisticated. But you read about situations, for example, where therapy involved, okay, you know, orderly, bring in the electroshock machine. Okay, hook one terminal up to me, hook another one up to the patient. This patient was a malingerer. She didn't want to live out in the field. She was a farm laborer. She just wanted to get diagnosed with depression, so that or schizophrenia, so that she could like rest in the hospital. So he would get them hooked up, and he'd say, "Okay, shock us." Okay, well, that's an interesting form of therapy. Right? She clearly ended up not staying very long in the hospital. And when he left the hospital, one of his peers called him up, his replacement called him after and said he'd encountered this woman out in the fields, and she asked him, "Is that crazy therapist still there?" So Erickson was just very, very intuitive in the way that he did things. Kappas, alternatively, just added all kinds of psychoeducation resources around his authoritarian hypnotherapy. And those resources are very valuable to us. So we'll get to a little bit more of that later on. But so the thing is that because the entire mind is unified and the conscious mind is there reasoning about what's going on, what we're doing is we're not changing conditioning, we're evolving new responses. The mind is coming to understand that it needs to do something different from what it did before. Okay, and it might be a new story, it might be a new design, okay? But eventually, as that story and design is accepted and implemented enough times, what is in the subconscious eventually is a conditioned response. But the therapeutic process is to evolve new responses, not to change conditioning. Therapy is unpredictable and intuitive, and there is a deep psychic bond. There's a book one of his students wrote called My Voice Will Go With You, where his clients report, you know, hearing his voice at critical moments, guiding them through. So this is something where you have to have both the therapist and the client have to have a certain amount of awareness, self-awareness. And this was typical of Erickson's environment. Kappas worked with people who were not sophisticated. They were blue-collar workers. They were housewives. They were entrepreneurs who just cared about what was practical in the world and getting ahead. Okay, they didn't have a sophisticated sense of who they were and where they were going in life and who they wanted to be, except for in a practical way. Erickson worked among academics, and all of his techniques were developed with people who were college graduates quite frequently. He did work with people who were kind of farm hands and things like that. But he used very different methods in working with those kinds of people than he did when working with people who are psychologically sophisticated. So again, it's all about making sure that you pick the methods that you pick are consistent, or when you are going to either provide hypnotherapy or seek hypnotherapy, that you pick the right kind of a partner for the process based upon who it is, who you are, and what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Okay, so now let's look at the theory of mind. So kind of a lot of these points have come out in the presentation, but I want to gather them all together here. So in the theory of mind, as we're taught in the introductory course at HMI, it does not explain satisfactorily the conscious-subconscious split. There's no reason why the things that Kappas puts up in the conscious mind, logic, reason, analysis, decision-making, and willpower, why those should cause the mind to break in two. Okay, and that's unhelpful to people that are struggling with the fact that the split exists and are trying to heal or change the behaviors and the conflicts, try to renegotiate the expectations on the two sides of the split so that they can have a more satisfactory life. It is explicitly authoritarian. It says, you take care of the 10%, which is the conscious mind, and I will take care of the 90%, the subconscious. The therapist owns the subconscious. And with regards to the psychoeducation, the other elements of psychoeducation that Kappas selected and provided to us in terms of helping our clients to plot their journey, to understand what they need to heal from the past and how best to move forward. The theory of mind as defined does not really provide hooks, so that after you've explained the theory of mind to somebody, when you come back in with something like stages of development or with the emo and phys relationship theory, okay, where you could, it's really obvious about how those things all connect together. Okay, and in fact, the way that the theory of mind is presented to people is it's supposed to be scattered and disorganized and kind of ad hoc, and it's supposed to create confusion, because that confusion enables you to get authoritarian control and get into their subconscious mind. Another aspect of the problem, Ellen, can you mute, please? Thank you. Another issue which is very important is it deprecates story, which is the phys way of being, in favor of design, which is the emo way of being. Okay, Kappas was a neurotic emo, and he really, and people that are neurotic believe that their way of doing things is absolutely the way that things have to be. And when you try to cast doubt on that, they get to be very defensive. And so what happens is that, unfortunately, the theory of mind, as he defined it, kind of pushes design up and up before story. But in point of fact, most people live stories. The vast majority of people live stories. And so it's important not to cause them to believe that there's something wrong with their way of living their lives. That's a perfectly acceptable way. In some ways, it's even more effective than the mechanisms of design. Because when you've got stories, many people can participate in them. Okay, and they don't even have to know necessarily what you're doing. They can anticipate it because they know that you're following the same story. And again, as I made this point already, but the overload and the way the thing is presented impedes the psychoeducation. The client isn't quite grasping what it is they've been told. Okay, so given that, these are all the factors that came together that motivated me to develop a different theory of mind. And so I'm going to start going through that now. And there's a number of slides here, 4 or 5 of them. I'm going to give the full spiel with all the details. Quite often when working with clients, I don't give the full spiel. I'm trying to provide all the hooks that are necessary then to add on E&P and to add on stages of development as necessary, and have the client feel that everything kind of holds together that they're learning, to not feel that, wow, this doesn't line up with what you said last time. Trying to make sure that everything, so I'm going to provide the full language that enables those kinds of layers to be added on as you advance through therapy. But quite often in working with clients, we don't need to do the whole thing. Okay, we can skinny it down, just like quite often you see in case history presentations. The seasoned therapist constructs and integrates the theory of mind in different ways, depending upon what the situation is. Okay, so I'm going to start going through this, and there'll be 2 endpoints. One endpoint, the last 2 view graphs, is one goes down the authoritarian path, and the other one goes up the collaborative path. So I'm going to provide both of these. What I do find is that the collaborative path has some real benefits for those people who want to take control and aren't just looking to do short-term work to solve a specific problem, but they really want to improve their relationship with themselves. And so it may also be something that an authoritarian hypnotherapist might want to present to people, just to give them a sense as to where, how they're going to be empowered to continue their lives after therapy is over. Okay, so let me start into this. So here's a picture. We're going to start talking about the mind and the way that the mind works and how the personality develops. And we're going to use a simple picture of the mind. And this circle here is your mind. Okay, and it's kind of, you can imagine like you're looking into towards somebody's face. And at the bottom of the mind is our survival instinct, which is our brainstem. And then there's the rest of the mind on top of that. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how the mind develops. So when we're an infant, we spend most of our time in kind of this happy learning state. We're taking in all kinds of sensory information. We're trying to figure out, what things happen together as we wave our hands around and try to squeeze our fingers and things like that. We're trying to figure out how to interact with the world. And most of the time, that's how we operate. But every now and then something comes in which is unpleasant. And that might be a loud noise. It might be we make a poo or something like that. But we go into this mode where we don't feel right. And so there's a part of the brain down there at the base of the brain, which deals with situations like this. And it puts us into a fight or flight state where we're rallying energy to solve a problem, to protect ourselves. The fight state, the fight choice is basically organized around, can I eat this? Okay, and the flight one is, can it eat me? But what happens is when we first go through this process, it's very hard for us to get ourselves out of fight or flight until we get exhausted. We don't know how to do that. And so what happens is mother comes in and picks us up and deals with whatever's causing us this discomfort. Okay, and she holds us against her chest, and we feel the beating of her heart like we did when we were in the womb, and everything slows down. And we feel her slow, calm breathing because her breathing is slower than ours to begin with. Okay, and she helps us, and so she teaches us how to come back into homeostasis so that we can continue to learn. Now, as we grow up and we get able to move around in the world and explore it on our own, we have a lot of different experiences. We have two basic systems in our brain that help us sort those experiences out into pleasant ones, and that's the euphoria system, and the ones that make us anxious, that are kind of uncomfortable for us, and that's the fear system. Okay, and so we go and we have these experiences. These are things that are familiar to us that become known. We know how to survive these things. Okay, but in point of fact, while we might prefer to be in the euphoric state, it's actually not sustainable. We can't be the child who goes and tastes the icing on every single cupcake at the birthday party, looking for the best one, the one that tastes absolutely the best. We can't do that. Nor can we be the child who hides under the bed when the guests arrive. So we need to maintain balance between these kinds of experiences. And what we do is our parents fill that higher part of our mind up with reasons and whys that help us to maintain balance between these two things. So this is a state, you can see that the mind is totally unified here. We're taking in information, we're having experiences, we're adapting behavior, we're learning new things, all simultaneously, all together, all at once. And then we go to school. Now, what happens is that, we're in the family situation and we've all our knowns and their balance in the family situation, we know, and that's critical to our survival. We go to school and now there's all these new expectations that come in. And the story that I tell about this, that explains, kind of like what kind of hazards exist in this situation is when I was in second grade, I was with a little friend practicing basketball in a little teeny second grade basket. And I was practicing layups and he was dribbling the ball with two hands. And these three older boys walked up to us. They looked to be about like fourth graders. They were big and intimidating. And the one in the middle points at my friend and he says, "This is my stupid little brother. He still believes in Santa Claus." And my friend grabbed the ball and froze in absolute panic. Mommy and Daddy lied to me? Or is my brother lying to me? He's older than me. And he's got all of his friends there right now. And so what happens to deal with these kinds of circumstances, the mind breaks into two pieces. There's a conscious mind which goes out and confronts society. And in that conscious mind is our I, our social identity. Okay, and that's a small part of the mind. It's only about 10%. And underneath that is the subconscious, which has all of our survival behaviors and our automatic behaviors like handwriting and things like that. Things that it knows that it's safe for us to do and that we've been rewarded for being successful with. And in between the two, there's this critical mind. And so what happens is that when we're awake out in the world during the day, dealing with society, and an unpleasant event comes at us, okay, we just do whatever we do, but we don't internalize it deeply. Then we go to sleep at night, and the information that's in the critical mind from the day gets transferred down to the subconscious. And the subconscious looks at what was emotionally important to us, what's the highs and lows of the day. Let's really focus on that. And it tries to figure out whether we can integrate that event in a way which is beneficial to us in dreams. And so the thing in between is called the critical mind. And that's this, it just slows down the development of our behavior so that we don't take something that society tells us and go and change the way that we sleep at night or the food that we eat and refuse to eat mommy's food or something like that, which might cause a real problem in terms of our survival. So now the mind's broken into two pieces, and then we become adolescents. And that second really powerful animal urge turns on. After survival, there's reproduction. And now the mind is broken in two. And society is telling us a bunch of stuff about romance. And we got these powerful feelings coming into our body that have to be dealt with because they distract us, and we can't sleep and things like that. And we can't get the two parts of the mind together to try to kind of reconcile these two sets of things. And if you try to repress this sex drive, it just gets stronger because the body knows that you need to deal with this. You need to reproduce. If you're going to have any meaning in the world as an animal, you got to reproduce. So there's just this terrible situation. And this is why we have such trouble with our relationships. Is because as we're trying to learn in this very uncoordinated, and it's complicated enough to begin with, we make mistakes and we hurt ourselves. And so the conscious mind and the subconscious start pointing fingers at each other. And this barrier of the critical mind gets thicker and broader. So one of the things that we do in hypnotherapy is we try to get the two parts of the mind together so that they can reconcile their differences. So the way that this works, we'll now go down the authoritarian path, okay? So the way that this works then is, as we've been describing, is that you learn something during the day, it goes through the critical mind, you fall asleep at night, and the subconscious decides whether it wants to accept the new facts from the day, and it goes and it dreams up new behaviors, and it tries to make sure that they're consistent with your survival. So this is what happens every night when you fall asleep. Now, what we're going to do in hypnosis is we're going to open a door in this critical mind. And we're going to have a conversation before we do that. And we're going to figure out what it is that you think you should be doing instead of what it is that you're doing now. And we're going to maybe think about how some experience that you have might be interpreted as hazardous to you when actually they can be beneficial to you, or vice versa. So we're going to take that new understanding, we're going to open a door here, we're going to drop it in as facts and behaviors into the subconscious mind so that it can begin to integrate those in dreams. So we're going to speed up this learning process in a way that's beneficial to you and it meets your goals for life so that you can fulfill your expectations of yourself. And maybe you won't work, okay? Maybe the idea that you have about how to succeed in life, when you actually do that thing, it won't feel the way that you expect it to. But you will have done that thing. You will have learned what it really feels like. And now you can go off and you can take the next step in your life and have a fulfilled life with no regrets at the end. So that's what we're trying to accomplish in hypnotherapy. Now let's go the route of the collaborative outcome. Okay, so with all this conflict in the mind, it would be really nice to get to a state in our lives whereby we can get rid of that critical mind and no longer have it blocking communication between the conscious and subconscious parts of the mind. So we can get back to that place where we're feeling everything with great vivacity and we're adapting to circumstances as they arise instead of waiting maybe for days or weeks before we make changes. And so where we're trying to go with hypnotherapy, the situation we're trying to establish is where our relationship to society is defined by our chosen virtues and our vices, where virtues simply are those things that create social cohesion so that we can participate effectively with other people in our life. And the vices are the things that we allow ourselves to do when we're just, I'm done with you people. I just want to go off and enjoy my pachinko or whatever the heck it is that you want to do. Okay, I want to be myself for a while. And so the vices allow you to separate yourself from society. And what exists up that enables us to do that, to get to that stage in the thinking part of the mind, is discernment. Where given our life experience, we have a sense as to what people are intending. We're able to intuit what people are intending when they present a proposal for our participation in the things that they want to do. And even when we subscribe to something, we always act in a way that preserves our dignity, which means that we don't do things that create unsustainable stress upon our bodies. We're dignified in the way that we conduct ourselves. And we always act with integrity. We never get involved in things that we're going to say later on down the road, wow, I really shouldn't have done that. That was against my values. How did I get talked into that? When we get to the point where we see that happening, we say, wait, slow down, stop. I need to do something different here. Let's talk this over. And so as a result of that, we are in all the experiences of our life, in balance with ourselves, fully connected to ourselves, and everything becomes sweeter and deeper. And that's what we're trying to accomplish with hypnotherapy. All right, that's the end of the presentation. I hope that it worked. It was clear for everybody. Are there any questions?
Thank you. That was great.
You're welcome. Ellen, is this the first time you've heard this? Leanne, how was it for you?
It was fascinating for me.
Okay.
Not everything was new to me, things that I had learned over the years and certainly didn't remember, but I feel like I understand it, and I just I'd like to continue learning more.
Yeah, I'll with this recording done now, I will post this up on YouTube, and there's a whole series of presentations. They tend to be more technical presentations that have to do with the practices of hypnotherapy. But I also, on my blog, I have a number of book reviews and things like that, which deal with specific topics in psychotherapy and behavioral change. And so you can read more out there at hypnosisrising.com. And I'd be happy to, if you've got something that you're particularly interested in, I'd like to know. My email address is out there. I'd like to know so that I can develop something that would be useful to you and other people as well. So thank you for attending tonight, Leanne.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, if there's nothing else, Thank you for your attendance, and have a wonderful night. Good night, everybody.